In this video, I'm going to take a look at a speech by the 4th century speech writer Hypereides, known today as Speech 3 against Athenogenes. It's a good one, and it reveals a picture of the seedy side of everyday life in Athens during the time of Alexander the Great. The underlying facts present a tale of infatuation, exploitation, human trafficking, dodgy dealing, and the sex work economy, with a good helping of xenophobia thrown in. It's a law court speech, and it raises some fascinating legal issues. My main interest in this text relates to what it has to say about the transferability of debts. The commonplace seems to be that the Classical Athenians did not have the concept of transferable debt, but this speech suggests it's not quite as simple as that. But the majority of academic interest is focused on the speech's value as a source for the ancient Greek law of sale. Welcome to Ancient Classics. Speech 3 was written by Hypereides for a chap called Epicrates. In antiquity, it was famed for the quality of its writing, but the speech never made it through the manuscript tradition intact. The last known manuscript was destroyed by the Turks or something. So our sources are limited to subsequently discovered papyrus fragments, meaning that the beginning and the end of this speech are missing. The speech relates to a claim in the courts by Epicrates against a man called Athenogenes. Athenogenes was a metic, a non-citizen resident of Athens hailing from Egypt. He owned a perfume business and several slaves who worked in that business. These slaves included a guy called Midas and his 2 sons. Hypereides' client, Epicrates, took a fancy to one of the slave boys. So, true romantic as he was, he decided to purchase the lad. I have no idea how old the boy was, and I'm not sure I want to know or to even think too much about it either. Athenogenes enlisted the aid of an escort turned procuress called Antigone to negotiate terms. She must have been well versed in the commercial dynamics of buying and selling persons, and it seems like she was a fierce negotiator, for she managed to persuade Epicrates not only to free or acquire the boy, but his brother and father too, and indeed the whole perfumery business with which they were associated. And on top of that, she also persuaded Epicrates to buy a girl, though she's only mentioned once in the surviving parts of the speech. Presumably she was to serve as Antigone's commission and put to work in her brothel. Now this is where the surviving fragments of the speech pick up. Antigone pulls that classic negotiation trope of making a big deal about how Athenogenes was very unhappy with the terms of the deal, but reluctantly agrees to accept a price of 40 minae for the 3 slaves and the associated perfume business. Now, it seems that Epicrates had originally intended to purchase the freedom of the boy, but instead he had been persuaded to purchase him as a slave, along with his brother and father. Now, Athenogenes allegedly said that this was the best way to do it, because if then Epicrates subsequently freed the boy, then the boy would be grateful to him, Epicrates, for his freedom. Whereas, if Epicrates had merely paid for the boy to be freed directly, then technically it would have been Athenogenes who had actually freed the boy. But that argument's probably absolute bullshit. Rather, it seems that Athenogenes really wanted Epicrates to buy the slaves, rather than to be paid to set the boy free, and specifically to buy the father, Midas, too. And this almost certainly has something to do with the fact that by acquiring slaves, one also acquires certain liabilities associated with that slave. I.e., if Epicrates had merely paid Athenogenes to free the boy, then Athenogenes would have been stuck with all the liabilities associated with him. Indeed, crucially, the terms of the transaction between Epicrates and Athenogenes were that by acquiring the slaves, Epicrates would also assume whatever debts the slaves owed. According to Epicrates' accounts, the debts that Athenogenes expressly disclosed to him amounted to the outstanding consideration for a purchase of myrrh and various other loans made to the perfumery business from investors or lenders. Athenogenes claimed that the acquired debts would be small and that the revenues from the perfume business would easily pay them off. So Epicrates agreed to the purchase, and Athenogenes produced a sale and purchase agreement. He read it aloud, and Epicrates was like, yeah, and signed it there and then. He then paid the 40 minae purchase price, and the deal was done. A while later, Epicrates learned the full extent of the liabilities that he had acquired, an amount equal to nearly 5 talents. Now, there were, I believe, 60 minae to the talent, so that's total liabilities of 300 minae, 7.5 times the purchase price of 40. And now the creditors, to whom these hitherto undisclosed debts came out the woodwork and demanded payment from Epicrates. So Epicrates consulted his pals and took another look at the sale and purchase contract, the one he'd just signed without really reading it properly. And anyone who's clicked through on a website terms and conditions knows what I'm talking about, right? And when he read the contract, Epicrates saw that he had acquired certain liabilities relating to the purchase of myrrh, but also crucially, he had acquired liability for kai toalo ophele timidas, i.e. he had acquired liability for whatever Midas owes to anyone else. Midas being, if you recall, the daddy slave that he'd purchased along with his little lover boy. Now, contractually, that's clear, and the contract expressly provided that Epicrates owed the smaller disclosed sum and a potentially unlimited amount of other unspecified debts, those at least originally incurred by Midas. But of course, that's not how the deal had been presented to him. So Epicrates goes to the agora and accosts Athenogenes, who denies all knowledge of the debts. Some bystanders intervened and recommended that Athenogenes be taken to court. That's the account of matters as presented by Epicrates, and we have to bear in mind that this is just his side of the story. Epicrates then proceeds with setting out the legal grounds for his claim against Athenogenes. Epicrates preempts that Athenogenes will seek to rely on a key principle of contract law. Hos onomos lege, hos an heteros hetero homologese curia einae. That the law declares whatever may be agreed between one man and another is legally binding and enforceable. The word for legally binding and enforceable is curia, neuter plural here. The general principle that contractual agreements between two parties are enforceable is also stated in a few Demosthenes speeches, which I'll put up on screen now. Epicrates, however, qualifies the principle, for he says that only just dikaia agreements are legally binding and enforceable. For unjust agreements, the law says the opposite. They are unenforceable. Now, just because a litigant purports to state the law, that doesn't mean that it was the law, of course. Even if we suppose that Epicrates' statement that only just but not unjust contracts are enforceable is a reasonably correct statement of the law, that still raises several questions, to me at least. Is it an absolute legal principle? If so, what constitutes a just or unjust contract? Are some kinds of terms absolutely and automatically deemed to be unjust? Or does a view have to be taken informed by the broadest context? Now, I'm minded here to think of modern-day unfair contract terms legislation, wherein certain unfair terms in contracts between businesses and consumers are unenforceable, there being a non-exhaustive grey list of terms that are always deemed to be unfair. Or conversely, is Epicrates' statement of the unenforceability of unjust contracts, assuming it is broadly correct, which it might not be, is it rather just an indirect paraphrase? Perhaps it was not the justness or unjustness of the contract or its terms, but rather the circumstances in which it was entered into, where, for example, a person is induced by misrepresentation, incomplete disclosure, or duress. Over the following sections of the speech, Epicrates seeks to raise further legal arguments. To me, it is telling that none of the laws cited are quite on point. So it seems to me that Epicrates is trying to infer a legal basis for his general principle that only just contracts are binding. To be fair, his arguments largely mirror those that have since evolved in English common law, but the fact that he can't cite any actual relevant laws suggests to me that he had no solid legal basis for any of this. But with that said, the Athenian court did not operate according to strict principles of legal precedent, so perhaps this was an entirely proper way of constructing a legal argument, and not so much of a try-on. But let's briefly look at some of those arguments that he raises to build his case. Epicrates declares homentoinon es nomos kalue absidein ente agora. This requires the telling of truth in the agora, i.e. some kind of rule against misrepresentation in commercial matters. When I read this, I wondered whether the restriction on telling lies in the agora specifically is metaphorical, i.e. the agora is a metonym for commercial matters in general, or whether it is literally and specifically a rule against lying within the physical confines of the marketplace itself. That would be fair enough in my mind, marking out the agora as a physical space in which particular commercial laws apply. And indeed, there are plenty of modern precedents for that. It's like having specific rules for dealings on a particular commodities exchange, stock market, or other trading venue. But there is a distinction to be made between a rule against lying in the agora or otherwise, and a rule requiring full disclosure of all relevant facts. Epicrates seems to conflate the two. Having cited the rule against lying in the agora, Epicrates said, "Yet you lied in the middle of the agora when you made the agreement to defraud me. But if you show that you declared to me beforehand the contributions and the debts, or that you wrote in the agreement the names of those whose existence I later discovered, then I should have no quarrel with you, and I would admit that I owe the money." Which is not quite on point, because clearly there's a distinction between lying and simply not disclosing all relevant facts. Next, Epicrates cites various laws relating to the requirement to disclose a slave's physical infirmities on sale, and laws relating to capacity and duress. Again, none of these points of law are directly relevant. From what we can tell, the slaves were in good health. But Epicrates' general point seems to be that the law recognizes that contracts should not be enforceable against people who entered into them whilst not in their right mind or following some kind of misrepresentation. After a brief digression on how Athenogenes must have known the full extent of the debts and cannot plead ignorance, Epicrates turns to a further line of reasoning, citing a law purportedly introduced by the 6th century Solon, that any offences or crimes committed by a slave shall be the responsibility of the master who owns him at the time. Now that may or may not be the case, but even if it were, i.e. that a slave master at the time being is responsible for damage caused by a slave and perhaps by extension debts incurred by a slave, well, that would not necessarily prevent that slave master from subsequently transferring the burdens to a willing purchaser of the slaves. So still, it's just another not entirely applicable argument. Another instance of Epicrates piling on whatever arguments he can in the hope that at least one sticks, or at least furthers the general point that unfair contracts should not be enforceable. But then Epicrates stops trying to build his legal arguments and returns to the facts of the case, explaining how he was duped into buying the slaves and the business associated with them, notwithstanding that he had only wanted to set free the boy and had no interest or experience in the perfumery trade. The text then breaks off, and that's all we have. We don't know how it ended, and we don't know what the outcome of the case was. Now, my main interest in this text relates to what it has to say about the nature of debt and on the transferability of debts, specifically here the burden of debts. The underlying theme seems to be that Athenogenes had incurred significant debts incurred by his slaves on his behalf and has used Epicrates' infatuation with the slave boy as an opportunity to offload his debts onto Epicrates. That in turn raises several interesting issues, such as whether and by what means debts could be incurred by slaves on behalf of their owner, and indeed whether debts are transferable at law at all. The commonplace seems to be that the classical Athenians did not have the concept of transferable debt, but this speech and various other sources suggest it's not quite as simple as that. And indeed, it's very well attested that debts of the deceased could be transferred in his estate. So my main interest in this speech is on the transferability of debt, but I think the majority of academic interest from what I've seen is focused on the speech's value as a source for the ancient Greek law of sale more generally, and indeed the question of what is a contract of sale. And I'll leave that question to a more authoritative source than myself.
My soul quaked in endless night, hurt shattered by a cruel blight. What is a contract of sale? I wept, lost in despair's veil. A wise voice from ages past guided me through the storm at last.
Heart lies torn by your deceit. Trust once strong, now feel so weak. What's this sale that stole my soul? Hypereides will make me whole. What is a sale? Is it an eternal bond between us, or just a fleeting give and take? What is a sale? Love's sweet vow turned to ash. Chains of lies and shadows clash. Broken hearts seeks ancient lore. Hypereides holds the cure. What is a sale? Is it an eternal bond between us, or just a fleeting give and take? What is a sale?
Infernal birds in black and flame, life fight streets to reclaim.
Is it an eternal bond between us, or just a fleeting give and take? What is a sale? Tears run dry. Text reply. What is a sale? Is it an eternal bond between us, or just a fleeting give